Okay, this video is a brief synopsis, a succinct expression. I would say perhaps one of the most elemental demonstrations of something a young seminary professor recently informed me of that he had been working on for a few years now, at least 3 years. So I began to speak with him, and I was very impressed that he had noticed this in the Bible. So I was wanting to just simply sound back and provide this for anyone that's a recent earth creationist. And that way I try to avoid old and young, because sometimes those terms aren't quite defined properly. Simply, for example, people do carbon dating but not carbon aging. Sometimes people don't define their terms as age as the amount of decay, and also perhaps the rate of decay. And can we notice, in a book called Genetic Entropy, the author of that book noticed the lifespans in the Old Testament as opposed to today, and the rapid entropy that we incur as humans. And briefly, I'll just point that out, is in Psalm 90, Moses wrote that. And then Genesis 6, he also wrote that. And in Genesis 6, it talks about 120 years. 120 years, let me mark this off. And then here it talks about 80 years. And then all I did was just add those together, and then my average is 100. So we now see that when Adam sinned, we can go to notice that he lived 930 years, and Methuselah 969, that no one lived outside the 1,000-year parameter. No one lived outside of that. So when Adam sinned and the fall, if we will, death entered into the world, he lived a lifespan within a 1,000-year lifespan, and we live within 100. So to give an example, this is Tim Carter right here, that's me. If I were to walk through 100 years in this life, and let's say I walked through 100 years, and in the year 2062 I finally expire, I will have decayed 100 years. That's aged 100 years. But let's say Methuselah, here the 969, let's say he walks through 1,000 years at the time when the 1,000-year window or span of time was that in which man lived. He would come out at the end of 1,000 years, and he would be 969, but he would have only decayed 96.9 years. And for example, to demonstrate that, or as I would say, prove it, Noah was working on the ark in his 500s, let's say 500 years old, or as I like to just keep it easy for my class and for you all, and for me as well, I'm 57, and if Noah was 570, we would look just alike. That is, our rate of decay, or the amount of decay we've experienced, would be the same. So if he reached 1,000 and I reached 100, and we had our funeral services on the same day, you by observation and I by observation could not distinguish the 100-year-old me from the 1,000-year-old Noah as far as physiologically. And that's something we can all readily see. But to give you an example, how does this apply? Genesis 3:17, cursed is the ground. You remember Matthew 21:19, he spoke to a fig tree and it withered immediately. So that went from not just dead, but decayed immediately. John 2, water was transformed into wine immediately. We also have instantaneity in the Bible. Of, let's say, recreation, a twinkling of an eye. That phrase is the adverb for Adam. Adam, A-T-O-M, for example. Adam. And since it's an adverb in the Greek New Testament, we would say something's done atomly. And that's an interesting term, because it seems to be the means of communicating the smallest unit of time. But here's a big one for people that want numbers to help them in defending a recent earth creation, for example, and to use the Bible and to use how would these lifespans and these different decay rates. So we've established decay rates are different. We established God pronounced, Moses did in Psalm 90, and even in that psalm we're taught to number our days, and yet we have birthdays only once a year, so we're numbering our years still. And in Genesis 6, God said 120 years his spirit would no longer strive with man. Now, this is not about the debate, is that lifespan or how long God's spirit strove with man. This is just simply to say we moved from I only live 100 years, no one beyond 120. Some are starting to have some exceptional ages bouncing up towards the 120 mark. And then no one lived outside the 1,000 in those days. But now notice this here. If at this rate that we understand for, let me clean this up a minute and move this out of the way. If let's take something dead, like let's just say the word dead. That way we don't have to imagine anything, because so here's something dead and it goes through, they age it and they say, oh, it looks like it's 1,000,000 years old. Well, how many years, according to this, would, if it decayed in this ratio that we know of humans, which there is no correlation, and when these are living people, this decay rate has to do with living. But now when something's dead, well, I'll just say me, I'll say I'm dead. How many years later would someone think me to be 1,000,000 years old? Well, I would only have to have been dead 10,000 years for that to be the case. And we know that's not 1-to-1 in decay rate. We know decay rate, for example, like a population curve goes this direction. We don't know the tipping point where it explodes. Same thing about decay. We don't know the circumstances. When does pressure begin to apply and it become exponential? Let's just put decay exponential, when it begins to accelerate. So we don't know that, but it's interesting that if you just applied this, and for example, I'm very quick to show the 6,250 year night and the 6,250 year day, and then just see that as volume. That's 12,500. Multiply that by a 360 day year, equals 4.5 million days. Multiply that by 1,000 years, and that equals 4.5 billion years. Sorry about my writing. But this is just as easily understood as the amount of decay incurred. So let's say when Dr. Al Mohler was the young, very brilliant professor I recently met with, told me that Al Mohler had stated and postulated or posited a question, why does the earth appear so old? Well, let's just change that. Why does the earth, why has the earth incurred so much decay in both amount and at what rate? Because we have revelation in Numbers when it speaks of lifespans on the earth for man. So I'm aware of the fact that I should count my days, because I am at a rate 10 times that of Methuselah in my expiration, if you will. The process of my dying has accelerated. God literally removed 90% of the lifespan of 100% of mankind. And originally, when Adam had no end of life on the earth, God limited his life to within 1,000 year span. So we went from 1,000 years. So if a doctor tomorrow told me he has bad news, and I said, what's that? He'd say, you'll live probably till 950 years or 930 like Adam did. Well, I would leave quite encouraged, because no one's ever been told when they're told when they'll die from a doctor, and they leave excited, because we always know that when the doctor tells us and gives us a terminal diagnosis, it's a shortened lifespan. It's a cut off of our days, or a shortened amount, a decreased amount of our lifespan. So we become very distressed. We have to begin to cope with that. If our child's given a terminal diagnosis, I have a friend right now with a terminal diagnosis, and it's not an expansion of time, it's a reduction of time. So if we lived within a 1,000-year period of time, we consider that a blessing, like in the millennial reign on earth for those who accept Christ's bodily return and his reign on the earth for a 1,000-year span. We look forward to 10 lifetimes, if we will, compared to what we have today. So with this information, we can see that we only have knowledge of lifespans and decay rates that are absolutely measurable and documented in the scriptures. We don't have records of how fast does something decay, but with reference to the earth, we do have ratios. And if the earth decayed at, let's say, 1,000 years per day, that would still have only taken 12,500 years for it to have decayed. So that when you look at it, it's real, actual. We know, for example, and I'll be quiet, I'm running too long now, but I worked in a company and we would use a very expensive raw material like brass and copper. So before we manufactured millions and millions of products that would use the brass and the copper, we would send samples to the lab, and we'd want to know what's the shelf life at 1 year or 2 years or 90 days or 6 months or whatever we wanted to know. Well, we could take that is the people in the lab could take those products that we use, our samples, place it into like a vault, a cabinet, and push some buttons and increase the pressure and increase the humidity to whatever would reflect the amount of exposure and decay that product would undergo and experience in, let's say, the next year, the next 36 months, or 60 months. So then let's say a couple days would pass and I could return to the lab and they could hand me those products, and then I would know if it showed corrosion, and if so, if it showed corrosion, premature corrosion, then I would reject that lot of very expensive brass or copper, and we would not bring it online and use it because something about the rust preventive was not there, or it wasn't properly plated to protect that against decay. Because if we made millions and millions of, for example, that was ammunition, rounds of ammunition, and we sent it to the market, and 5 years later it was all corroded and we had to recall it, that'd be billions of dollars worth of liability and loss. So I literally come from a background, and most people could think of a place where that's practiced, where we would accelerate decay all the time and simulate aging. And we all know that if we are overexposed to the sun, we age faster, decay more quickly. So this is just to use numbers we all know and to provide feedback for the young, brilliant professor who's been working on this for a few years. He's right. He's absolutely correct that as I would use this illustration, that if I would take this and apply it, which just doesn't directly correlate. I'm just saying, if I just took this as, let's say, a guess, if you will, because we don't have revelation of this. We only have God speaking to us about life and death as it applies to human beings created in his image. But in Genetic Entropy, the book entitled Genetic Entropy, the author had noticed this entropy and how much more quickly people seem to be decaying. Now, he didn't know the equations. You can reverse this 1,000 years per day. It's third grade arithmetic. But notice how easy it is for someone who supports recent Earth creationism and who would like to give a rationale for even Dr. Al Mohler's observation that why does the Earth appear so old? Well, change the word old from old and change it from age to decayed. Why is it so decayed? And that would be nothing we would ask about the fig tree. We would know why. God had said something, cursed it, and we know now, we have the answer here, the earth has been cursed. So for recent earth creationists, this would be a very key element, and for that brilliant young professor, this would be really good as he fed back to me and sounded back, and I heard what he was saying, and this is a good succinct reflection of what he said, and I would conclude that he has made his case, QED, and that's it. You've got all you need here. So I hope you enjoy this, but if you're a recent earth creationist, this would be something you could take your King James Bible. There's no Greek up here, there's no Hebrew up here, there's no textual criticism up here, there's no disputed text up here, there's no whatever else is out there, there's no creationism constructs, young earth creationism or old earth creationism. This is just information, data collected from the text, and it gives good evidence that the young professor had noticed in the text, and I was very encouraged that he had noticed these things, and he helped me stop and pull this together to give it back to him. And I hope he enjoys this, and if it's helpful to you, enjoy it. If not, just leave it alone or give it to someone that might find it useful. So you have a blessed day.